Hey, it's Jackson. Welcome to the Science of Happier Work, where we offer science-based tools and lessons to help you as an individual be at your best at work and help you take this to your team or organization so you can expect things about how to re-engage your passion and improve your work-life satisfaction, as well as how do I bring this to a team? How do I actually shape the sort of climate of my organization? All of those are things that we'll cover here every couple weeks. But today's topic is about the interesting intersection between happiness and performance. And this applies both, again, to individuals all the way up to organizations. So we'll begin with a discussion of some of the literature around how this applies to individuals, and then we'll transition into organizations. Of course, we have businesses, but also military, nonprofit, education as well. But let's start with the year 1887. You step back into the time machine with me, and we're going to go back and talk about a gentleman named Adolf Fischer. Now, this man was wrongfully accused of starting a riot. I believe it was in Chicago. My history's not perfect. So they accused him of starting this riot, right? So he's falsely accused, and then they get falsified information to convict him. And ultimately, he's sentenced to the death penalty. And as he's standing at the gallows, the floor about to drop out from under him, he screams, "This is the greatest day of my life." Now, around the time that happened, there was a gentleman by the last name of Eastman who invented the Kodak camera. So he went on to be extremely wealthy, but not only was he very wealthy and successful as an inventor and entrepreneur and business leader, he was a philanthropist, and he actually really advocated for his people, his employees, kind of a workers' rights type person. So he was a huge supporter in this, right? He made it part of his life's mission. He was immensely successful, and later in his life, he sat down one day, wrote a note, smoked a cigarette, and then surprised everyone by shooting himself. So the reason I share that story, right, these two seemingly kind of opposite people, one seemed to have a horrible life. He was falsely accused, and on the day of his death, he said, "This is the greatest day of my life." The other seemed to have had it all, and he committed suicide. It speaks to the sort of misunderstandings we tend to have about happiness. And what we often tend to not quite understand so much is that there's a sort of a surprising science or surprising relationship between happiness and success. And it's not what we typically think of as success first and then happiness. Now, if we re-examine that story, that's a story that comes up in a book that I highly recommend, Stumbling on Happiness, Dan Gilbert. He tells that story, and he points out, well, if you dig a little further into it, you have this guy who was a Fisher, who was a complete nobody, right? No one knew who he was, and he finally got this notoriety, and he sort of died in support of a cause that he really supported, right? It was around, again, workers' rights. And then you have Eastman, who he lived a rich, full life, and towards the end of his life, he started to get really serious physical health issues that made it so he couldn't do the work or the hobbies that he really enjoyed doing. So he simply said, "Hey, I'm content here. My time's up. I'm going to go." So there's more than meets the eye when it comes to understanding the nature of happiness. And that's a lot of what today's talk is about. And we're going to particularly examine that when it comes to the relationship, as I said, between happiness and success, or success and happiness. So the standard narrative that we get, I believe, goes something like this. You graduate high school, you leave the nest, you move to a new place, make all new different friends, right? Then you get a really good major, you work super hard, then you get a great job, and then you get promoted, you climb the ladder, you settle down, American dream, wife and kids, husband and kids, whatever, and kids, white picket fence, whatever. And then finally, at some point, I'm not sure when, you get to be considered successful, and then you check that off and you're happy, right? And I think we all know that this is not quite how it is, but generally that's still the model we get. It's a very achievement-oriented view, right? That happiness comes from being successful and achieving your goals. And I'm not against goal achievement, for the record. We'll do a different video on that, I'm sure. But that's sort of the model we're getting. Well, there's a few studies. I can't reference all of them. I'm going to talk about 3 of them that start to disprove this sort of model or this narrative that we're given by society. The first, I'll talk about two at once. One actually comes from a book called The American Paradox, Spiritual Hunger in the Age of Plenty. And the other one's a 2010 paper by Kahneman and Deaton. Now, the first book, American Paradox, they essentially talk about how over the last, let's say, 100 years, GDP per capita, right, both metrics, of course, have steadily increased. Right? Every year, we're all effectively getting richer. Now, that doesn't speak to some of the nuances of income inequality and wealth distribution, but generally, we're all getting richer. Our standard of living has improved. However, our quality of life, not so much, because they offer the same graph where you see income rising, GDP, you see happiness is about the same. And so they pose this question or this paradox. Why is it that despite all of us being richer and having more economic resources, we are not happier? And that's where Kahneman and Deaton's paper comes in. And now this is a sort of a famous paper at this point, and it's actually recently been disputed, which I'll talk a little bit about. So in this paper, what they essentially found is that around $75,000 in household income, happiness starts to level off. Not perfectly, but it's what we call diminishing marginal utility in economics, which means that basically $1,000 to me would be pretty great. $1,000 to Elon Musk, he's probably not even going to notice. Okay, so the more you have of a given resource, the less valuable it is on the margin. So this study, what they saw is that around that $75,000 mark, which today would be around probably $120,000 if you adjust for inflation, $120,000 pre-tax, you see happiness is sort of increasing, and then it just starts to kind of level out. They also point out that there's two dimensions of happiness. There is kind of emotional, experiential happiness. And then there's reflective happiness, life satisfaction, stepping back, how satisfied am I with life? The more emotional, feelings-based one flattens out much quicker. And the thing that money kind of boosts up a little bit more is the more reflective, because you're comparing, right? Oh, I make this amount of money and I'm in this career. I guess I am pretty happy, right? So it's an interesting nuance. But that being said, that's the pattern that they saw. And it kind of makes intuitive sense. Again, once your needs are met, sure, more money's nice, but it's not going to be the be-all, end-all. Now, there was a gentleman, I believe it was last name Michael Norton. Not 100% sure, but if you check it out, you can find it because the study was everywhere. It blew up about, I want to say about a year ago, that said, hey, we have data that actually disproves that the relationship between income and happiness continues rising and rising and rising. Now, I'm not going to go too far into the details. I've done a previous video on that, and you can ask me about it if you're curious. But I push back against that study because he used what's called a logarithmic scale. So when you look at his graph, what you see is happiness and income kind of rising together. But when you notice the scale of the graph, it's not a linear scale. So it's not saying I'm steadily increasing my happiness as I go to say 50,000, 100,000, 150,000, 200,000, 250,000, and my happiness is steadily increasing. No. The scale at the bottom is more like 50,000, 100,000, 200,000, 400,000, 800,000, a million. It's sort of increasing exponentially, and then he finds that happiness continues to increase. So it's not very practical. Because the Kahneman study is basically, it's linear. So it's saying, hey, if you're already making $100,000 and you make an extra $50,000, it's good, but it's not going to really change your life that much. Norton's study is sort of looking at a scale of if you're making $100,000 or maybe $200,000 and you double it and you're making $400,000, you're going to be happier. So it's like, sure, but practically speaking, I don't think us trying to, consistently double our income indefinitely is a very practical approach. I prefer to keep it linear and think about, hey, if I was choosing between spending a little more time with my family or maybe exercising a little more or making an extra $10,000, what should I do? I think the Kahneman and Deaton scale is much more appropriate and much more practical. So anyway, you have this idea of diminishing returns there, right? So the reason I share all that is because this idea of we continue to climb the financial mountain and keep pursuing our goals, probably not ultimately going to lead us to any sort of lasting happiness. And a bit more anecdotally, you can think about the hundreds of celebrity stories where you see this coming up. You think about some of the more publicized ones like Robin Williams. Jim Carrey, I believe, talks a lot about this. I think he even has a quote where he says, I wish everyone could be multimillionaires and successful and famous just so that they know that that is not the answer. So I believe when you look at sort of the economics, diminishing marginal utility, you look at the literature as a whole, and you look at sort of intuitive common sense, right? It stands to reason that money's not the be-all end-all. Another study I'm going to reference here just because I think it's quite funny is King, it's King, Lyubomirsky, and Diener. And what that study shows is, sorry, I'm following my notes here. Oh no, it's actually, I apologize, 2003 from Diener et al. So in this study, they look at a sample of German women, right? And this study, it would be nice to have the graph, but I'll explain it to you because I don't have a visual here. You basically look at year 0 is the year that they are married. So let's start 2 years before the year they're married. Happiness is down here. The year before, it increases. The year of their marriage, it peaks, right? So it's going up, up, up. Marriage, this is it. This is the climax. And then 1 year after, it starts to fall back down. And 1 year after, it falls back down again. So if you picture almost a triangle, like the roof of a house centered over the year of marriage, it's this roller coaster effect of building up to getting married and then crashing back to reality. So again, speaks to this idea that, when you hit that's sort of a lifestyle metric for success of, oh, I got married, we did it, we did the thing, right? Not saying marriage is a net negative or you shouldn't get married, but again, it's simply saying that it's not just the be-all, end-all. So we've kind of explored there a couple ways in which this typical narrative, right, of should be successful, settle down, American dream is maybe not so accurate. So what is the relationship between success and happiness? Well, let's turn our attention to the work of a couple other folks. So the first one is Shawn Achor, researcher out of Harvard University. He wrote a book that was massively popular called The Happiness Advantage. Very well-written and well-researched book. And what it essentially finds is that it's the exact inverse of the relationship that I articulated at the beginning that we typically think of. It's not that success fuels happiness. It's actually happiness that fuels success. And he points out, one of my favorite lines in the book, he says, happier people are more creative, they're more engaged, and they're more effective. They tend to have higher levels of energy and higher levels of extroversion, which helps them to build social connections and relationships. And ultimately, all of that supports them being more successful. They even see things like correlations with healthier immune systems, which again, you miss less work, you have more energy. So he makes a really compelling case in that book that it is actually happiness that's the foundation for success. And I'll also reference the one that I misspoke earlier is a study from King, Lyubomirsky, and Diener, which was a meta-study. And they looked at a huge sample of literature and basically found that the same conclusion, that positive affect, right? So a wealth of positive emotions. That's what we'll refer to here when we say happiness. There are a number of different tools or assessments you can do for it, but generally speaking, let's call it the abundance of positive emotion is predictive of better outcomes when it comes to success in areas like marriage, friendship, income and earnings, professional life and work, as well as health. And again, this is maybe somewhat intuitive. Think about the type of person that you want to surround yourself with, or the type of person that's going to be kind of very successful. It's not Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh, right? It's someone who you enjoy being around. They're alert. They're upbeat. They tend to see possibility. They're optimistic, right? And they have a high level of emotional intelligence, and they're able to build those quality relationships. So the bottom line is for individuals, it's actually happiness that fuels success. performance. Well, how about for organizations? Well, we'll touch on a couple studies here. The first is a sort of a snapshot. And in this study, they wrote about it in Fortune a couple years ago. They created this Thrive XM index. So they worked with data providers like Qualtrics, SAP, I think there were a couple other ones. And they kind of built out this index of the top companies in terms of like employee experience and almost like employee happiness, right? The idea of they were thriving. And this study was just a snapshot. They looked at Q2 of 2020. The companies that were in the top percentile of the Thrive XM index compared to their industry peers, they had an EBITDA margin that was 4% higher and a return on equity that was 5% better. Now, again, that is just a snapshot of that particular quarter, and I don't necessarily know why it is that they just focused on that quarter. I would be curious to see this expanded out now over the last several years or maybe over a 5-year period. But again, still a snapshot to say at this moment in time, they performed better, and of course they controlled for a number of other things. So it's pretty clear that there's something to be said for this. But if we're gonna zoom out, right, beyond that performance snapshot of one quarter, there's one theory that is particularly interesting here, and this is called the service profit chain. And this was developed by researchers at Harvard. It explains how employee satisfaction affects customer satisfaction. And it essentially is about a feedback relationship. So if you're not familiar with feedback, right, that's sort of the self-fulfilling cycle idea. And it starts out by saying when employees feel satisfied at work, they tend to produce higher quality goods or services. So you think about the cycle coming up here. When customers receive quality goods or services, they're more likely to become repeat customers. This creates more revenue for the company, which likely improves employee conditions, which then makes them happier. And then that feeds back into the quality goods and services, the customer satisfaction, the repeat customers, the customer retention, right? And it creates this sort of virtuous spiral, an upward spiral, so to speak. And the researchers point out that companies can use this model to increase employee and customer satisfaction and along the way, improve profitability. And if you search the service profit chain theory, I'm not gonna spend too much time explaining it, but that's just an overview. You'll be able to find many more resources on that, and I think some of the original research papers. Now, a final piece of research that is worth mentioning, again, as we draw this connection out, we already said for individuals, happiness fuels success, and we started to get at how ultimately actually workplace happiness fuels company performance. We saw that in this Thrive XM study, how their quarterly performance for the happier companies was higher. We talked about the service profit chain theory, and I'll share this one from Gallup. Gallup, really, really high level, highly respected research organization, particularly for businesses. So you think about highly engaged business units realize an 81% difference in absenteeism and a 14% difference in productivity. Engaged workers are also more likely to stay with their employers. So high turnover organizations, highly engaged business units achieve an 18% difference in turnover, right? So they start to look at this and they think about, how can we model even within a particular organization engagement levels in different units and tease out how that impacts things like retention. In low turnover organizations, the gains are even more dramatic. So highly engaged business units achieved a 43% difference in turnover. And the kind of thresholds they use here for high turnover organizations had more than 40% annualized turnover, and low turnover were less than 40% annualized turnover. So you can see, right, just in this engagement piece, the immediate revenue and cost implications you have when it comes to retention, right? Because you think about the retention, you have not only the first order consequences that I call them of lost operational productivity, you have the recruiting and retraining and hiring costs, maybe even overtime because you have to fill that role depending on the nature of your operation. But you also have second order consequences, right? Like loss of institutionalized knowledge. If you have someone who's been there for quite some time and they're moving on, you have just disruptions to the workflow and all of kind of the second order losses in productivity, or same thing with attitudes, right? If people saying, oh, another person left, and they get frustrated. So immediate operational kind of consequences there, but there's even more. So customer outcomes. Employees who are engaged consistently show up to work and have a greater commitment to quality and safety. So these employees improve customer relationships and growth for the organization. So again, they find highly engaged business units achieve a 10% difference in customer ratings and an 18% difference in sales. So here we have less maybe the cost side levers and more of the revenue side, right? You have more engaged sales force, customer service people, account executives, etc. Right? They're going to be driving more sales, and then customers are going to be more satisfied, which feeds back into those second order consequences, right? But always in any organization, the cheapest customers to sell to are the ones you already have. Right? So a lot of advantages there. And they roll this up finally into this Gallup report, which I can reference to or link to. And they say there's a 23% difference in profitability based on engagement levels. And so I pick engagement here because you don't always hear the term workplace happiness or happiness at work tossed around, but I think engagement is probably the closest piece of vocabulary we have to it. In our model, which I'll share in one of the episodes or talks here, engagement is a part of our workplace happiness model, but I think it's kind of one of the closer variables you can look at, right? Because engagement is this sense of satisfaction, intrinsic motivation, and interest in the work that folks are responsible for doing. So I hope that in this video, you appreciated some of the science here. I'm a bit of a nerd myself, so if I went too far into the weeds, I apologize, but this is somewhat what you can expect from our videos here every couple weeks. This is much longer than my typical talk or my typical podcast, but because it was one of the first episodes, I wanted to share a little bit more in depth because it's probably one of the most, maybe the most important insights we have to offer is this very strong and highly validated, when you look at the scientific literature, connection between both individual happiness and success and organizational happiness and success. In both cases, having sufficiently abundant positive emotion is actually the fuel for success. It is not a consequence of prior success. So thank you for watching or listening, and I will see you here in the coming weeks. And as always, you can find us at happinessmeansbusiness.com for corporate, warriorleadertraining.com for military, and I will see you next time.